This is the Cliff Yates Show. Personal growth, motivation, inspiration, and philosophies for a great life.
Hey everybody, you're at the Cliff Yates Show, and as always, you're in the right place. I'm so honored today, and so, man, I'm actually overjoyed that I have a great guest on with me today. Someone I can actually call a true friend, and we've kind of reconnected recently because of our mutual interest in podcasting and putting out a positive message, and we're going to get into that. But I'm so happy to introduce retired L.A. Sheriff's Department Chief Pat Jordan. Pat, thanks for joining the show.
Hey, Cliff. Thanks for inviting me, and it's good to see you again.
Absolutely. Before we get too far into it, I mean, part of what I love doing after retiring is I never thought that continuing to serve in some aspect of life was still going to be so, joyful. And so you continue to serve, and you have some great things that you philanthropy that you do, particularly with the LA Mission. Tell us about that.
Yeah, when I was still working, I joined the foundation board of the LA Mission. So that would have been probably 2019-ish. And I continued to serve on their board even after I retired in 2021. And one of the reasons why I've served on their board is I continue to serve on their board is I saw that the good work that they do. Now they're an organization that services the homeless on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. They serve over 400,000 meals a year to the homeless on Skid Row. They provide them with some basic services, underwear, clothing, and if they want a night off the street, not all of them do, but if they want a night off the street, they'll give them a sheltered bed. And if they want to recover, and if they want a chance to reintegrate back in society, the LA Mission has those services too. They are a faith-based organization, so they're not getting money from government. It's all on them. And what I like about them is for a few years, probably about 5 years, I developed an expertise in anti-recidivism programs. I got a really good idea of what it takes to be successful. And a lot of those things translate over to homelessness because a lot of them are involved in criminal activities just to survive. And they use many of those same therapeutic programs for the homeless, which indicates to me, and those are all evidence-based, results-driven, unlike the policies in California, which drive me crazy. They actually get it done and get it done right. So I support the Los Angeles Mission. It's at lamission.org. You can make a donation if you want. I plug it on my show every day. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing I do in terms of charities. But one of the reasons why I stay active in terms of my voice is we went through probably 8 years of unrelenting attacks on law enforcement. I mean, it was still going on when I was still working. It was unbelievable. You didn't get it from the regular communities, but the far left and unfortunately our politicians allowed for this really negative narrative to come out by law enforcement after the Mike Brown situation in St. Louis, and then Minneapolis with George Floyd, and they painted all law enforcement with a negative blush, and they also mischaracterized the 38 years that I worked in law enforcement, implying that everybody was racist, and nobody was standing up for law enforcement, or at least a few did. They were not getting traction in mainstream media, and when I started doing commentary on public events on radio, I liked it because I got to speak up for the men and women in law enforcement who could not. Because if you're still working, you could become a target simply by expressing your opinion.
That was exactly the same thing because I was researching, you can write your own book, you could do this. I was into, after producing comedy shows, you can do this yourself, all this solopreneur stuff. And then I was like you were just saying, I was like, and wait a minute, this is, what they're putting out there is such propaganda. And so actually my first book, not well written, but from a truth point of view, was, the truth about cops and why you should trust them, because the narrative, like you said, was so anti what was truth. I mean, they would focus on one bad thing and try to really blow that up. And I was thinking, so that's why I wrote that first book, because after being in the recruitment division and involved in backgrounds, I mean, my whole view was, if people only knew what departments across this country go through to try to get the best candidate, what they actually go through, and how focused they are on the background process. If they knew, because the news kind of painted a picture, we grab people off the street and then we put a badge and gun with them. And so I wanted to get that out into the public. Hey, no, this is what we really do to try to sift through and get and it's a very, it's an involved process. And so I described it in my first book. And so I went along exactly with what you're saying.
Right. And, and most of the people who are our critics would never get through that process.
No,
So-
yeah.
But they're given credibility because they're in the media or they're the head of some, age or some nonprofit funded by Soros or whoever.
Right,
They're given
yeah.
credibility because people listen to them, and even a lot of the professors who sell this stuff in college couldn't get through those background checks
No way.
that we went through.
Oh, no.
And yet we're all looked at with suspicion. And in addition to that, and I'll add on to that, and most of them couldn't handle the level of scrutiny that law enforcement has on them, even before, before
right.
this 8 years. The level of scrutiny and oversight, most professions do not have to deal with. Fire doesn't have to deal with it. Teachers don't have to deal with it, and certainly our politicians don't have to deal with it. The level of scrutiny that goes on, they work very hard at keeping their transgressions quiet, right? But
Right, yeah.
the excuse is always more training and more accountability. Actually, the truth is, how about we speak realistically about what does it take to take somebody to jail? How about we speak realistically about what it takes to keep a community safe? And what are the actual authorities that a law enforcement officer has, not this fairy tale that these leftist organizations sell, that they should be.
You're getting into, in the perspective, I came from a perspective, upstate New York, small department, 20 deputies, and then to come in the green, the behind the tape perspective that we get, specifically in the LA Sheriff's Department, 10,000 strong deputies, and then to have that perspective behind the tape in all these situations in the homes of the rich and the poor and Hollywood, that we get behind the scenes and actual all these variations of life. And so we see a truth that is genuine in that you just normally wouldn't get a free ticket to. And so we bring that perspective that I think is very important to get out there. Luckily, we have these forums now, and we can get that out there to the people. And to a point that you brought up, which I didn't like at first, one of our sheriffs, Sheriff Baca, he had the civilian academy, which I didn't like at first. But you know what? Everybody that went through that at civilian academy, these were members of the community that were able to ride along in patrol cars, go into dispatch, go into the jail system, go onto the range, learn how to shoot a gun. These people became our staunchest supporters. Do you have any experience with that?
I read a book years ago called Code Zero.
Yep, Code
And
Zero.
it was about a liberal. You read that one, right?
Yeah,
It was
I
a
did.
Liberal, I think it was a Berkeley professor, right?
Yes.
Anti-cop, all that.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
think he was the 60s or 70s was his time. And he, he would, and some guy was in his class who was either a reserve or he was a police officer, and he challenged him. You don't know what you're talking about? You need to go and ride along. You need to become a reserve. And so he made it. It was a science project for him. He made it a social service, a social studies project. He was going
Right.
to go, and he was going to get into this. And I remember one of the first things he goes to some very a dangerous event in which somebody actually, I think, tries to kill him or tries to kill his
that's
partner,
right. Yeah.
And he sees it firsthand, and then he began to understand why law enforcement might have the perspective that they have, and that the perspective is not necessarily bad. So even before I got into the department, I'd already had experience with that, and it was pretty clear because I got my degree later in life. I was 35, and there was a lot of these leftist professors teaching there, and it was always fun to spar with them. But they teach, but they don't really. A lot of them don't really have the experience. And this guy got the experience.
Yeah.
Wrote the book Code Zero. Laid himself out there that he was wrong and misunderstood. And I think he continued as a reserve officer for a while. I can't remember.
I think he did. Yeah.
And he became a proponent for law enforcement, or at least he became somebody who advocated that we need to take a deeper dive into this to understand it. And so that's and of course you have ride-alongs where people sometimes you get the cop hater who you're stuck as a ride-along with you,
Of
but by the end
course,
of the
yeah.
shift they're
Yeah.
relaxed and they're like it and they like you and you go, well, this was fun. I didn't
Yeah.
realize this was, because they
Yeah.
have no idea. They're thinking you're running around beating people every day,
Yeah.
and no, you're. they, I'll give you the stat just because I do this all the time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there's a report, and I forget the name of the report that the federal government does every 2 years, and they look at police contacts, and they. You're familiar with this report? They look at police contacts, and then they say, well, what percentage of time does police use force on the people? And I think it came out at 2%, which I think is high, right?
That was high. Yeah. Yeah.
That's high. Why is it that? And then you look at the definition of what they call force.
Correct.
Right? So then I dug in that. What's the definition of force? Well, force is when you actually physically use force on somebody, but also force is if you make a threat. Point a gun at them. That's a threat. Point your pepper spray at them.
Yeah.
I'm going to pepper spray if you don't put your hands behind your back. That's a threat. And I thought, and here's the challenge that the public has with this narrative. So federal government decided to do this report, and I'm thinking it probably started on the Obama administration. Maybe it was sooner. I don't know. Or later than that. I don't know. But I'm just thinking a bunch of bureaucrats going, well, we need to present this negative aspect of law enforcement. Let's look at the numbers. Oh, legitimate force used against people. Well, that's really, really low because I think I did the math. It's point
something, 0.1 or 2.
0.002.
Correct.
The amount of force used. So you take the number of contacts. Let's say it's 60 million, and the number of people who used force, and it's not even 1%. It's not even a half percent. It's so much lower than
unbelievably
that.
lower. Yeah,
but they defined force as a threat of force, I think, to inflate the numbers, and that's the kind of dishonesty that's going on.
That's the kind of thing we just get upset about because some people are not paying attention, or they just get their news from a flashpoint. And from my philosophy training, I've learned that people react to perception and not reality. And you see that come out, right? If you ask people on the street, and they've done this, right? Well, how many times do you think police, shoot people and kill them? And 2003, it comes down to and digits basically, and it's just unbelievable. But that is perception, and people so as much. And here's what I get frustrated about, and I'm kind of excited about, but no one talks about it. Pat, is that they'll be talking on the news about what the police could do. They could do this. They could have a mental health go along with cops. And I'm thinking, we did this 20 years ago. We were already doing these things where we had mental health people riding with us, going to calls, making an assessment and evaluation at the time, and to get them resources. All these things that they're coming up with. I'm actually proud to say that we were way ahead of the curve on maybe 20 years of a lot of these ideas.
Well, a lot of the ideas, they don't really want law enforcement there at all, right? So they want to create a separate response system to respond to these. And I keep working my way through this logically. Well, why would they want a layered approach to a response? It's inefficient, it's expensive, but it's all a bunch of government employees who get pensions and are in unions that support politicians. It's we're not directing. They're not an on-ramp to treatment with private hospitals. It's one more bureaucratic layer that they're adding on there. And I think the thing that, in defense of police officers, relates to the mentally ill, the addicted, whatever, and the care first advocates. Well, you know what? Doctors and nurses and people, they've been there with us. They've been our partners there. The ones that cared for a long time, and certain mental health agencies were always there, never enough. And but we were always the people who were there. We were 24/7. We were the social workers of last resorts, and those that wanted, like the LA Missions, one of them, they always kept a couple beds open for law enforcement if they needed to drop somebody off who's homeless and to help solve that problem. But they were few and far between, and it's like suddenly government wakes up. Oh, we need to do something about the homeless. It's like,
Yeah.
Where have you been for the
where you
last
been?
35 years?
We
Why are you
wish.
attacking the police?
We wish that we could just focus on crime, and they dumped the mental health issues on us. So we were given a no-win situation, and if you're videotaping, it looks ugly sometimes. And but guess what? Things have to be done.
So I was working on developing a pilot, and the pilot was the LAPD would cite people for relatively minor violations in Skid Row. It would go to the city attorney. So LA has its own city attorney. It prosecutes its own misdemeanors. And then they would come into court either at arraignment or sometimes they figured out sometimes they had to wait till they sobered up before they offered this deal, right? They said, hey, you can go to jail and do your time, take the plea, or you can fight it, or we can divert you, right? So
diversion programs,
It was a rapid diversion program straight from Skid Row, targeting that community. And it was a pilot. But one of the challenges that we had was, so you'd come in, and by the time you come from the bus from the jail, wherever you were coming from an LAPD jail to the courthouse, you're already either late morning or early afternoon. And all the social service agencies where you would want to, so you'd have somebody would come and interview somebody with mental health and a navigator that would find them a bed, right? They would interview them, and then they would start calling everybody up. Hey, do you have a bed? Do you have a bed? Do you have a bed? We have this guy. And they would all say, well, our intake person gets off at 5. So, that was, I'm thinking, wait a minute, they want to go to a care first model, but their intake person gets off at 5, so they can't. So, and I said, well, why don't we have one intake person that has a standard intake form and that multiple nonprofits would agree to, and then you can do it after hours. And I don't know if they ever did that, but my point in telling this story is the reason we were engaged in the mentally ill, the reason we're engaged with the homeless, were because a lot of the people with the masters and PhDs in psychology and whatever that are doing these jobs went home at 5 o'clock or didn't work.
Yeah.
Saturdays and Sundays, right? They had people maybe managing group homes, but a lot of the other people were gone, so they didn't have the capacity. That's why we were involved, and that this isn't some evil conspiracy by law enforcement and to discriminate. The medical folks just weren't there, and the bottom line is I don't know why they couldn't stagger. They could have come up with solutions for some of these folks with these PhDs. And if you spend 8 years going to school to get your PhD, or even let's say it's 5 or 6 years to get your master's and counseling, and you have to do all your hours, and they say to you, hey Cliff, congratulations, we got a shift for you. It starts at 7 o'clock at night and it goes till 3 in the morning. It's the happening time, and you're going to work Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays, but you know what, that's where and you're thinking, well, I just spent 6 years. I want to do the day job and get the 6 figures. I don't want to do that.
Yeah,
I think
tough.
that's part of the problem.
It is.
Blue collar guys are dealing with this stuff.
There's so much going on, and I'm because of a manuscript loss, I'm rewriting my book Deputy, and so I'm talking about the fact. And I was from 78 to 82. I'm in upstate New York, and I had this visions of grandeur of going to a large metropolitan agency, which maybe you had the same path. But I remember going, I saw an ad for New York NYPD. So, man, I'm going to go down to NYPD. And it was only a 5-hour drive. I had never been to New York City growing up at all. So now my mom and my aunt, they go with me on the train, 8 hours. We get down to NYPD, in New York City. And I take the police test. And, man, it is, I guess if you compare it to today, it's probably 2 times as worse. I mean, Grand Central was a terrible place. Times Square was definitely peep shows and drug addicts and crime, and it wasn't safe. And though, man, I was really excited by it, just being in Manhattan with the energy, and I was loving it. And so that's where I wanted to go. And man, to go there years later, which I think was 91 or whenever, Giuliani came in and they went to to go to your point, when they started focusing on the broken window theory and just, enforcing minute laws. I mean, they started cleaning up Manhattan man, it just became a beautiful place for tourists to be able to come. They got rid of the squeegee people, right, who would actually force you to give them money, or you might get a squeegee across your windshield. And so, man, the stark difference that I saw from when I took the test in 82 and going back in 91, 92 was just unbelievable, the results that they got. And to kind of see that degraded today to what's happening with no enforcement, wow, it's very sad.
Well, it's let me frame that and for California.
Please,
I moved to California in 81 and I joined the Sheriff's Department in 83. Detroit at the time, which is where I'm from, was economically depressed. There wasn't a lot of opportunities, and things were kind of rough at home. So I just said, I'm out of here. I was 19, had a couple $100 in my pocket, and said, I'm gone, right?
Yes.
And struggled for a couple years, but I got in the Sheriff's Department. My dad was a cop, my uncle was a cop, and so I said, well, I could do this for a while till I figure out what I want to do. I needed benefits.
Yeah.
And so I started doing this. But one of the things as I started doing podcasting and I tried to understand, what was going on at the time, where were we at in 2014, where are we at now, and so the highest crime rate in California, they had about 14 homicides per 100,000 in 1980. So that's just before I joined.
1980, yeah, because I joined 83 too, yeah.
Yeah, so in 80, and then it kind of dipped a little bit, but it peaked again in 1993 at 13.1 homicides per 100,000. So this is the whole state.
Okay.
Right, so the cities are diluted by lower crime areas in California. Right. So
yeah.
LA, I think I saw a number. They were like at 24 homicides per 100,000 in the mid 90s, something like that. So it was pretty high. And by 2014, we were down to 4.4 homicides.
Oh, really?
Per 100,000. So that's the work. When you talk about broken windows theory.
Yeah.
When you talk about broken windows theory, so, and the way we should be framing this is, okay, we when I first joined, you went after felonies and guns, right? We didn't sweat the small stuff. And broken windows theory pretty much said, hey, you got to sweat the small stuff.
Yeah.
And if you remember at the time when we implemented broken windows theories, there's the things that we did. We called them high impact surveys. Our surveys. So we would survey the community to see what was actually important to them.
Right.
And the burglary that happened down the street that nobody saw was not that, but the graffiti they saw on the wall every day was very important to them.
Very, yeah.
The guy who blew the stop sign every morning really upset them. Traffic was one of the number one issues out of the top 5 in every region that we did these surveys. But also the guys drinking beer in the park after curfew. And so what are all those things? Those are all quality of life things.
Quality of life,
those
yep.
bother people.
Yes.
And the same people doing that are the same people that are doing burgs, are the same people that are hanging in parks drinking, are the same people that are intimidating people. So when we start enforcing that, what you saw was this dramatic decrease in crime because it was a small number of people who were actually doing the crime. And I read Giuliani's book, Turnaround. He lays a lot of this stuff out, and we did that, and we were very successful. And I want to give you some numbers because I was on a radio show.
Wait, was that Giuliani's or Bratton's book, Turnaround?
I'm sorry, it was Bratton's book.
Yeah. I read it. It's awesome.
Did you read it?
Yeah.
And actually, I used that strategy. You worked for me on transit for a while. I used that strategy. It was very effective.
Very effective.
I think
Yep.
The difference for me is I gathered stats. So when they came after me for accusations of, well, there's more people of color getting tickets, I had gathered like 3 years of stats to show all of our enforcement efforts and how we did them. And behind closed doors, I briefed all the politicians and they left us alone.
Yeah.
I don't think my replacement was, she didn't take my advice.
Right. Yeah. I got
told her, you got to keep tracking this stuff and be ready because they're going to come after you. Right. And
that's right. Yeah.
But I did a show on Friday, and it was they had asked me to comment on Lewiston, Maine, right?
Right, yeah.
And in preparation for that, I saw a tweet from our governor in California, not your governor. You're a California refugee now, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, "Oh, we have all of these laws in place to control guns, yada 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 yada, and Maine doesn't. So that's why they have the shootings." Okay, all right. So I'm like, I'm so tired of this dishonesty, right? So I look up Maine's murders per 100,000 in 2022, 1.7 per 100,000 in the state of Maine, and
Hmm.
they have a gun culture. They have a lot of
Yeah,
guns,
they do.
and so
Yeah.
our honest, governor, 6.8 in California. So think about that. Since 2014 and 2022, in what's that, 6 years,
Yep. Six
seven, no,
years.
8 years, 8 years,
Eight.
we more than doubled. No, wait a minute. No, we didn't double. We went up at more than 50% in homicides per 100,000 in the state of California. And our governor's gloating about how he's doing a good job on gun control.
Yeah.
And this is the misinformation that's out there. And
Yes.
and he's pointing fingers at Maine. They should do what we're doing. And I'm like, God, I hope Maine doesn't do what we're doing, because look, we got 6.8 murders per 100,000.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about broken windows, to bring it back to it, we did a good job. We moved away from broken windows because they've argued that it was racist, even though it's based upon science, which they always said, oh, this is all based upon science. Well, so is the broken windows theory, John Q. Wilson, the broken
Yep.
windows theory,
That's right.
community oriented policing, all that stuff. We lowered crime, which means if you go from 13.1 homicides per 100,000 to 4.4, what have you done? You've saved probably tens of thousands of lives.
Yep. You have. Yeah.
And that's just murders. That doesn't
Yeah.
include suicides. That doesn't include overdoses. That doesn't include all these ancillary benefits that you get out of this. Then we pulled back from that. We embraced criminal justice reform because it's more equitable and it's less discriminatory. And our murders shoot up more than 50%. But the worst part of that is we got rid of community oriented policing and those strategies because they were disproportionately impactful to people of color, particularly black
Yeah.
people. Yet, the people now dying with these new policies in much higher numbers are people of color, particularly black people. So
Correct.
if the policy you put in place is considered racist because too many black people go to jail, if the policies you put in place and more black people are dying, which one's worse, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that doesn't get out there, which is why we got to do podcasts.
We really do, because it's been it's just that narrative that's constantly pounding. I don't know. Megyn Kelly was recently on Grant Cardone, who's a real estate guy, and she was really, man, she laid out some great things out there about what's going on today and why we have to stand up now and say something, because
Yeah.
most good people, which is the predominantly 98% of everybody, is okay. You're we gender what's it called, dysphoria or whatever, is a real
Dysphoria,
thing.
yeah.
And so if you want to do that, it's that's, who's going to say, live your life, that's great. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh no, I'm gonna compete with the women, and I'm going to beat them, and I'm going to get grants, and I'm going to get scholarships, and I'm going to go into the locker room with women also. Wait a minute, now, well, hold on. And then so a line was crossed, and now people are saying, well, we got to stand up. I mean, it's and so this is what's happening today, and which is a good thing, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's I hate using the term woke stuff, but that's what's been coined, right? So
Yeah.
these woke policies are an attack on what we call the Enlightenment. And I know you're familiar with that because
Yep.
you've been
Yep.
studying philosophy, right?
Correct. Yep.
And the Enlightenment is what identified the primacy of the individual, or the importance of the individual, and that certain rights are God-given and cannot be co-opted by government, right? And
Right.
that came to the idea of human rights. The God-given rights, led to human rights. Human rights led to the Bill of Rights, which we see in our Constitution. And one
Right.
of the most important, and just to frame it in a way people can probably understand, more people can understand your comment, is one of those rights is the right to freedom, right? The freedom of religion. I'm sorry, the freedom of religion. That we are a country that is tolerant of people who have who practice a religion that may not be our religion, or maybe we don't even agree with, right?
Correct.
So, but the left has decided anybody who practices religion that is not accepting of transgenders, not accepting of gay marriage, not accepting of abortion, then they're all evil and they're bigots.
Correct.
And we no
Yeah.
longer are tolerant of people of faith. We've decided that they're all evil and bad. And that's which, if you told me before the pre-show that you watch Steve Friend, and he gets into that, right? And I can
Yeah.
talk about that in a little minute. But so what we've done is what do they call it? They call it the illiberal left. Is they're not tolerant of anybody who has a different opinion from them, and even if you're even if your opinions are derived from faith, and it's mandated in our Constitution that you have a right to have that faith, and we must tolerate that faith. And government has been going after people of faith.
Right.
And that's where I think we're really into dangerous territory, because they've decided to, well, in the name of this person's rights, we're going to suppress these person's rights. And the reason why this country was formed, if you remember back in the old, when the Mayflower hit the whatever the rock over there, whatever that rock, I forget the name of the rock, and
Plymouth Rock.
I think it
Yep.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were escaping religious persecution.
Correct.
They were
Correct.
escaping religious persecution. They're Calvinists. There was a particular kind of
It was Anglican was the
Protestant,
established
yes,
religion.
and anybody
Yeah.
who didn't believe in the Anglicized faith left, and because they were being persecuted, and that weighed heavily on the founding of this country and the Bill of Rights. But now we have these woke folks have decided, well, anything created by a white man can't be trusted anyways, because it's all seen through the prism of racism. So we get to reject the concepts of religious freedom, and we just get to call you all bigots, because religion in their mind is just a tool for oppression, and that's okay. And the crazy thing about it is, as if you witnessed the interview with Steve Friend, is our
Yeah.
government went along with it. That's the crazy part of it.
But yeah, and this is what I can't figure out what, and of course I still have family, friends in California, and my wife, we have my her two boys are still in California. One is with us, but and they're on the sheriff's department. But and she said to me in 2019, hey, listen, because I wanted to move to Florida. We can never move to Florida because the grandkids are there, and I go, okay, I'm okay with this. And when the shutdown started happening, and she's so sensitive, she says, "This is communism. I don't even want to. We were here vacation. I don't want to go back there. I can't be shut down. This is what they do. First they start with this, then they go. This is totally Cuba." And so, yeah, and that's how we ended up moving here within 45 days, right? And we're still here. But
well,
yeah.
let me tell you the story.
Please.
That it did not really get a lot of press, and that really bugs me. And it talks about the failures of COVID response in Los Angeles County in California, right? So I graduated from the Naval Postgraduate School. It was the Homeland, the school, the leadership program from Homeland Security. It's Homeland Defense and Security is what it was. And so I had access to conference calls very early on when COVID was happening. So there are people, graduates from all over the country, and you're invited to listen on the conference calls of what was happening as it was happening in the states that were getting hit first
Right.
with COVID. And one of the things that I heard was in Washington State, they had a cruise ship that came back. Some elderly folks were contaminated, and they went into their elderly folks home, and a whole bunch of people died in that old folks home, right?
I remember.
And I was
this.
listening to
Yeah.
that, and I was listening to the stories of what was going on in Italy, and older people were dying. So it clearly targeted older people, the pandemic, right, COVID. And I said that, and people looked at me like I had, three eyes.
Three heads,
because, yeah, just we're just not, that isn't. And I had read up on pandemic stuff as in the course of doing Homeland Security stuff, and so I was pretty familiar with it. And obviously, I was a graduate from that school, and I tried to talk about it, but the senior managers, they weren't there yet, right? We were eventually
Yeah.
being we got there, but the people who didn't get there were public health. So what that meant, if you were paying attention, and this is what they did in Sweden and they did at some other jurisdictions, is you looked at your most vulnerable community and
Right.
you put your most protection efforts in place to protect them. And we didn't do that. What we did, and if you remember correctly, Governor Newsom says, we have to house the homeless. So they emptied all the homeless shelters, which is reasonable. You can't keep them in these centers, but if they have medical problems, so they are most vulnerable. They weren't the most vulnerable. Our elderly were the most vulnerable. But you never heard them say anything like that. we have to, the ACLU and the governor, we have to empty out the jails and the prisons. These are the most vulnerable. So we did that. But we didn't prioritize our seniors, right? We did not prioritize our senior. To Alex Villanueva's credit, eventually he figured it out. It was a few months into it. I mean, I had said something to my bosses, but I was involved in an accident, and now I was at home, right? I was out, and I was deciding whether I was going to retire or not, and but I had said enough, and I think they picked up on it. I don't know if it was me or they just realized, hey, what about the seniors? And because I had done an exercise before I left, I said, let's identify all of our senior citizens' homes in the area and let's check and see what they need, if they need anything. So they went through the exercise, although they didn't understand why I was having to. And that was the product I left when I went out injured, right? And I don't know if that's sponsored or anything or not, but so after the pandemic is over, we had, I was tracking public health's website on who was dying, and seniors were dying. And finally, they did a report. Finally, they had Max Huntsman, who was the Inspector General of the Sheriff's Department, did a report, and it was a blistering report on LA County's failure to protect our seniors. They did not make sure that they had the appropriate protective gear, both the staff and then seniors themselves. They did not surge resources to the senior centers. We're too busy housing homeless people who are on the streets. We're putting them in, when you're out on the street, you're spread out. You're probably not going to be. And they did not have the data. The data did not end up showing that the homeless were really any more risk than anybody else, but the seniors were. And our governor and our public health department, in my opinion, never prioritized them. This blistering report came out, and Max Huntsman, for all of his faults, he did a good job. He laid it out where they failed. They didn't have proper training. They weren't prepared. They didn't have the proper equipment. We didn't surge resources necessarily. The state and the county didn't do the proper oversight on any of these before this happened. And people died because of it. And I can't remember the number now, but it was incredibly bad. And a few paragraphs on the LA Times and faded away. And now, years later, the governor's realizing, we probably made some mistakes during COVID. Hey, how about somebody hold that guy accountable for failing to address our seniors and keeping our seniors safe? They didn't do it. The Board of Supervisors didn't do it. And that's, for me, that's failed public policy that doesn't get out there because it's detrimental to the Democrats. And this is a blue state, so they don't want. If they didn't like Newsom, they'd do a Como to him. They'd get it out there. But they like Newsom. He's their guy, right? Because they did it to Como. But this same thing happened in this state, and it flies under the radar because the media and the Democratic Party in the state are on the same page.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll marvel. I go, wow, I forgot. I haven't seen graffiti on a wall in like 2 years. This is so great. I got so used to it. Man, it is. We're really enjoying our time here in Free Florida. It's been really great. And I went down to
last February. I went to Florida, and of course the homeless population is growing in LA. It's getting worse.
Yeah.
It's like the more they do, the more come. They never seem to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I go to Florida, and it was around Jacksonville and in that area. I think St. Johns County or something like that.
Yeah. It's kind of the north near Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah, we ended up going to Orlando for a day. A bunch of guys I went to high school with. We were just hanging out.
Great.
Having a good time. And I didn't see one homeless person. I
didn't
see any graffiti.
We have a few here that are, they're like beach bums. You know what I mean? There's a few. They lay on the beach, but I mean, not to the extent of it impinges on anybody's free movement around her. That you're, I mean, and go back to California. One thing that we're talking 25 years ago. I think I brought this up with you on another podcast. That I just loved when I first visited San Francisco, just because of the architecture and the history and going by the waterfront, and then to go back. I think we went back like 10 years late. I mean, these homeless were grabbing us, and I mean, they were so aggressive. It was like, we can never come back here. And we tried to see a show down like with the Tenderloin district there, and it's just, oh my God, this is not even safe. And it was sad, man.
Well, I want to, which brings up, there's a very interesting thing about, so we talked about high crime, right, in the 90s in LA, right? And you were working then. And I was sent, in 98, I was sent to Century Station, which is at South LA, right? And so that's where the stuff is happening. And I couldn't find a Starbucks to save my life down there, and I was hooked at the time. And I
Yeah,
mean, I
you get
had to
hooked,
go
man. Yeah.
to the city of Gardena just to get a cup of coffee from Starbucks at the time. And then, but the crime was, I was kind of underwhelmed in the level of crime. We were having an impact. It was still busy, but it wasn't as busy as say it was in the 80s and early 90s at Century Station.
Yeah,
And lo and
before they were
behold,
there. Yeah, because I was at
yeah,
Linwood before there was a Century. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? They opened up a Starbucks and businesses moved in because crime was lower
Correct.
and
Yeah.
people saw opportunity. And here's the other narrative about um, what we benefited from by lowering crime using broken window series. And John Q. Wilson kind of talks about it. If you let something be blighted, then it'll be blighted. If you take
Correct.
care of it and clean it, then people will see it differently. And so once you lower crime and you take care of the graffiti and all that other stuff, then people see opportunity. Money flows in, right? And money flowed into these communities. Yeah, at Starbucks, obviously that helped me, but grocery stores opened up, other businesses opened up in those areas, malls opened up in those areas, and grandma didn't have to drive, 50 miles to go to the grocery store. She could just go a couple miles down the road. But the
Yeah.
other thing that happened when you do that is property values go up. So grandma who bought the house in 1960 and has lived there and hung on through all the bad times, suddenly the little house she bought for 25,000 is worth 250,000, and that's her nest egg. And that was an outcome of lowering crime. That's an outcome of
Correct.
lowering crime. So what's happening now that we see crime spiking up and we're not doing anything about we're doing very little about retail theft? What's happening? Those retailers are leaving those areas.
It has to
So what
be.
happens when you leave areas, right?
It, it
Hope
has to be a
leaves,
purposeful
job
thing,
leaves,
right? They're doing this on
values go
purpose to
down.
kill the malls, right? They're killing the malls off for this reason, I believe. They want malls are
Well,
pretty
it's
much dead now because of this retail theft is kind of wiping them out.
well when you evaluate what we did for 40 years in cleaning things up and putting people in jail, even though they might be disproportionately people of color, but if you look at the data, they disproportionately commit a higher number of crimes. The benefit of that is less of them are getting killed, right? Less people are getting killed, and businesses are moving in, and the color of importance is green. Everybody gets to
Yes.
make money. Everybody gets hope. Everybody has opportunities. And that was the benefit of the work that we did and the men and women who worked with us did in LA and in many of the big cities,
Yeah.
as we talked about, New York under Giuliani and Bratton and those guys working there in New York, as well as the LAPD. Bratton came out here, brought that with him,
Yeah, that's right.
and jobs move in, hope moves in, everybody's happy. So crime is going up and jobs are leaving, hope is leaving, and
Yeah.
everybody's looking
Yeah.
for somebody to blame.
Yeah. You know what people do now? Here's what they do. They go to the mall and they look at this item and they go, "Oh, on Amazon I can get it for $2 less." And they order it, and before they get home it might even be there. And
Yes.
so the retail store didn't get anything, but it's being shipped from Amazon, so maybe one of the company will survive that's producing it.
Well, I went to, and this is impacting wealthier areas. I live in a fairly wealthy area, and I went to a CVS to buy something, right?
Right.
And you know how they have they have the kind of the peg boards and they have the wires that kind of stick out and things are placed upon the wires. Well, now the pegboard is much more reinforced. The wires are reinforced, and they have a cap and a lock on the end of that pegboard. So if you want to buy something, you have to get them to remove that lock. So you just take this medicine that normally you just get and you go pay for it, over-the-counter medicine, no big deal. But everything is locked up, and that's what's going on. So those stores that don't really lend themselves to an Amazon, like drugstores or
Right.
even
Yeah.
beauty,
No. Yeah.
those things that people want to go and browse and touch and think, and or they just need to go get something real quick because they need it
Yeah.
today. Those are the places that are closing up. Grocery stores, same things. Those are the places that are closing up, and so now we go from places that have grocery stores and Starbucks to deserts where they don't have those kinds of things,
Yeah.
and many of the same politicians who attacked the police are the ones now complaining about the results of their policies.
Yeah. I don't. And man, this is why there's just going to be I don't know, a reawakening or repatriotism of the country, and we're just going to have to stand up for these principles. Look what's going to happen to Mike Johnson. They're already going after him. Although that guy is a stalwart, I don't think he will waver. And as soon as he, put out his Bible principles, and I think that's important that, the government and what a guy like Mike Johnson will say, you don't have to be a Christian. It's just that we are based on Christian principles. If my neighbor is not a Christian at all, he does not believe, but he follows, I'm not going to kill, steal, cheat, or come. He's living under those Bible principles. He doesn't have to be a believer, but those principles are it creates a quality of life, like you said. And man, the attack. And of course, most people say, and I guess it's in the Bible, I went to a men's Bible study, if you're not being attacked for those beliefs, you're not really putting them out there to be attacked, and you need to stand up more. I don't know. What do you think?
That's an interesting philosophy. I think as we talked about the Enlightenment, most of the rights and the values that we have derive from our faith, but also a re-examining of our faith after the Reformation and into the Enlightenment, where the individual is most important,
right?
And that people have God-given rights, but the woke side of this said, well, the principles of the Enlightenment challenged all of us to look at the discriminatory practices of our country and correct it. Women didn't have the right to vote. They got the right to vote. We had slavery. We got rid of slavery.
Right.
We had Jim Crow. We fight Jim Crow. All of these things, these efforts to fight. We had abolitionists who signed the Constitution, so they existed at the beginning of the foundations of our country.
True, yeah.
And they fought for decades to get rid of it, all to culminating in the Civil War, right? So it is these religious values that drove us to recognize our failures as people and correct them. Now we swung full circle to where we have this notion that, no, everybody, you're guilty based upon the color of your skin. You're seen as oppressors based upon the color of your skin and whether you have clout and power. We look past any social issue that might be contributing to one community's failures over another's, right? And the latest events that happen in Israel really demonstrate that, because if you read some of the liberal lefts on critical race theory, they all look to, we were discriminated against, and it's these evil white guys, black. Everybody's saying, even Jews are saying we were discriminated against and we were victims, and I'm not saying that they weren't, right? But as soon as October 7th happened, they got labeled as white European colonizers and oppressors. By these same groups. So these groups who are interrelated and who believe in critical race theory, they are in conflict themselves as well. There's nothing, their principles don't bring them together.
No.
Their principles are divisive, whereas the principles we have are designed to bring us together and challenge us to be better than we were before and to embrace those principles, these woke principles. You identify people based upon the group they're in, and they are virtuous or unvirtuous based upon what group they're in, and the benefits they should get from society should be based upon whether they've been more of a victim or not. In this case, now you have conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, and particularly Jews, and the woke left has decided, well, the Jews are the oppressors, right? And I think they're shocked at how they're being treated. I think it's shocking, the anti-Semitism that's going on.
I can't even. And I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to your point on that. But first of all, like you said, it's opposite world, right? Because these people were oppressed because they were treated disparately because of the color of their skin, and so now guess what? And now, you white people are going to be judged based on the color of your skin. So it's opposite world, right? So now, and if you are designated, your outcome is based on that, then there's nothing you can do about it, and that's the message that they're saying, well, you can't do anything about it. You're white, so you're wrong, and you're an oppressor. And then now that's going to invigorate people to take certain actions. And you and I specifically, and another kudos to the LA Sheriff's Department. Number one, in the academy, I had to go to the Museum of Tolerance, and then I had to go again when I joined when I was a sergeant. Then I had to go again when I was in the Leadership Institute. And so, never again, right? And who would have thought, based on the education that supposedly everybody was getting on these horrific things that we, hey, don't turn your head away from this. Look at what happened so that this can never happen again. And so, like you said, to see this anti-Semitism, I'm like, somebody's got to be teaching this, because there's no way that anybody would react this way.
Yeah, I think it's being taught in the colleges, and you saw the tepid response of many of the professors as there's like Harvard's 30 plus groups of students signed a letter, supporting Hamas, without really addressing the horrific actions of Hamas against the Israeli people, and it wasn't just Israeli Jews. Yeah, I mean, there were folks who were guest workers from other countries who weren't Israeli. I mean, I saw them trying to murder a Thai person. I think they did murder him.
Yeah.
Muslims, the Bedouins who lived in the Gave, the desert there, they were targeted. Everybody was targeted by Hamas. Nobody was spared, and Christians weren't spared. So you were Israeli, you were a target. It didn't matter who you were, right? And
Yeah.
the fact that so many people have come out to support Hamas while ignoring the actual atrocities of what that Hamas did is outrageous. It's outrageous
shocking to me. Yeah.
It's shocking to me.
And yeah, they can't even find Israel on a map. And of course, maybe it's an awakening. I gotta portray my own ignorance here, that I didn't even know that there were these Muslim Students of America, and it started long ago with Students for Justice, and then we had all these groups, and some of these groups I'm suspecting really aren't American citizens, that some of them are members of these groups, and maybe they're, they should be reviewing their visas to see if they've overstayed them and what the real agenda is, right?
Well, I think when they start doing the anti-Semitic tropes against them, they're like, I think one of them I saw, they implied that the Jews control all the media, and that's one of those typical tropes out there that is, it's a dishonest lie, or that they're manipulating society, and that's all that stuff is just lies. But it gets told, and those are the things that are not getting shut down by the leadership at these colleges.
They're not.
We actually have members in Congress that stoke this, members of the squad. You can have a disagreement in policies and how we address Israel, the two-state solution, all of that. I went to Israel in 2013, and I would say I'm fairly well read up on Israeli history, so I have a perception, right? But
yeah,
and a lot of it in the early time, Israel really did want a peaceful solution to this problem.
Absolutely, all the way back to the 70s. Even remember Gaddafi was saying, "No, we need to wipe all these people out."
Right. When the UN gave them partition, meaning gave them a country, 5 Arab nations and the Palestinians attacked them, and they fought. I think they lost 1% of the population. They fought them to a standstill, and then gained more territory. And they fought several wars, and there were a lot of atrocities against them, as we saw on October 7th as well.
Yeah.
So it's not as easy a history as many of these advocates for Palestine would have you think. But,
no, let me interrupt you 1 second, because this is something I didn't. Again, my ignorance. I didn't know that Israel was really not created or reestablished as a state until 1948. So if you were born in 1947, your birth certificate actually said Palestinian. You're considered a Palestinian. And I didn't know that, Hadrian, right, back the Marcus Aurelius days, he kicked everybody out of there. Ryan says, not only am I going to kick you out of here, I'm going to rename this Palestina, because it'll remind you of the Philistines and disrespect you. It's amazing history that goes back to biblical times, right?
It does, and I mean, I can understand why we had the development of Israel. I mean, because you had the pogroms, that's what October 7th was in my mind, a pogrom, against Jews in particular, and people felt unsafe in Europe. I mean, it's happened to Russia and everywhere.
Yeah,
and then you had the
right.
Holocaust, and clearly, and that happened, and people were looking for a safe place, and the world, they didn't step up. For the most part, didn't step up and do the right thing. Even the U.S. turned ships around that had Jews, and they ended up going on to their death in the camps. And and so they decided, well, let's let them have their country, right?
Right.
Let's do that, and that's where that came from. And it's complicated because people were displaced. They left on their own. A lot of Palestinians, but some were displaced by Israelis. But they also, so there was a lot of things that happened at the time that maybe we could resolve, but there was such that people were at such odds they did not want to negotiate them. But where you did see negotiations, Jordan negotiated with Israel. They gave up part of that land, which was
That's
supposed to
correct.
be
Yeah, that's right.
for Palestine, right? And then they negotiated with Egypt after a war, then gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and they've been at peace with Egypt and Jordan for the most part since they made those. And leaders did that. Sadat was killed, and Rabin were killed, and those are
Yeah.
the people that were involved in making peace. So there's definitely a risk for real leaders when they do these things. And just to be clear, they gave up Gaza to the Palestinian Authority in exchange for peace for 2004, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And by 2006, I think Hamas had taken over, and they started shelling Israel fairly soon after that, and they're committed to the destruction of Israel. They're not really an occupied territory, which gets thrown out there. Gaza's
No.
not. But obviously that serves the narrative. So they were given the land for peace, and Israel didn't get peace. They just got war.
Well, and they quoted this recently that he was a commander of the Hamas group or whatever, but he said, people in Israel, they want to live, and that's their weakness. We want to die, and that's our strength. You're going against a mentality and an ideology that is really, all this was a pretext for Islam, and they're on a different agenda, and they're very patient. They might wait 10 generations before they get what they want. And hey, do you remember, you must have known Viktor Frankl. Have you read his book, A Man's Search for Meaning?
I know the name. I have not read his book.
Yeah, I've read it like 4 times. And I just read another one by Viktor Frankl. He came up with this logo therapy based on putting meaning in life. But he was very shocked. He was one of the few after the Holocaust. He was in the camps for 3 years. He lost everybody. They murdered everybody in his family. And he was watching how people committed suicide, ran to the wire. And because he was a psychologist before he went into the camps. And so he was into how people, created a meaning in their minds, and they were able to survive where other people killed themselves, really. And so he went back to Viennese, Austria. That's where he's from.
Vienna.
And he was just so shocked that, his own people were like, oh, we didn't know that was going on. And so he said people, they turned away and didn't want to see what was happening. And so a lot of that, I see that as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, wow, this is really going on right now today. People want to see that. As a matter of fact, there's a pastor out where you live, Jack Hibbs, out of Chino Hills, and it was interesting. And he says, I don't get my news from America. I get my news from Al Jazeera and all these other agencies because they put it out there. It's raw. I'm getting raw news.
Yeah, I was watching. And actually, when I was in Israel in 2013, I was getting a tour, and we were talking about these issues. I was talking. The guy that was giving me the tour was a lieutenant colonel in the IDF.
Yeah.
And we toured around Gaza, and they had some graffiti art of the Twin Towers getting crashed into, and they were celebrating it, right? So they didn't like the U.S. The Palestinians did. Right at the exchange point where you go to Gaza and between Gaza and Israel, and he said these guys will never forget. They're always going to come after us. And we have to hit them, harder than they hit us. And I got an explanation of the Iron Dome and all that stuff, and unfortunately, I think they were kind of asleep at the switch. They're a great military tradition, great intelligence tradition, but they fell asleep at the switch when they were dealing with this. But these folks, they want to wipe out Israel. That's the Hamas. That's what they believe.
No,
right?
Yeah.
And anybody who gets in their way, keep in mind, Gaza was turned over to the Palestinian Authority, who are much more moderate. They don't like Israel, but they're much more moderate.
Yeah.
And the Hamas killed all those leaders, just as viciously as they killed the Jews on October 7th. So, as you said, they're committed to one mission, and that is that mission.
Yeah, it's funny, and God, no, people don't want to go there, but it's just my men's Bible study, and I wasn't brought up in the church or had no education or wasn't even saved until years later in my life. But the fact that even in Genesis, it's definitely written thousands of years ago, it was set forth. This is Israel, and these are the boundaries. And you can just go on and on with the history that's going forth today. This tiny little country that's mentioned in the Bible, that wars and rumors of wars are going to happen here, and now it's being prophetically happening, not anywhere else, only in this little tiny place that said it would happen here. I mean, we could go on for days on that. I'm just learning more. In my lifelong learning, maybe that's a good thing that's going on, that we are opening our eyes to a lot of things.
Well, it's disappointing that our educational institution, particularly colleges or universities, are not exploring these things. Obviously, they see anything as faith-based as something that needs to be rejected. I mean, when I studied Western political thought, one of the great Western political thinkers was St. Thomas Aquinas, because he looked at the structures of the church, and he looked at democracy, and he saw them as being compatible, and he wrote theories accordingly, right?
Theologia. It was the basics of Christianity. Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And so the primacy of the individual God-given rights is consistent with human rights.
Correct.
And what we're seeing in the Middle East, particularly in these extremist, is nobody has human rights unless you're Muslim, and we have to go back. We've been dealing with this since the beginning of our country.
Correct. Hey, it's funny.
The Barbary Wars. Barbary Wars, where Thomas Jefferson asked, "Why are you guys taking our citizens hostage?" And the comment was, "Well, you guys are infidels. We get to do that because we're Muslims." I mean, that was basically the response. And then we went to war with these.
So it's funny. I got like 5 books on St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm not even Catholic, but I love him. How to Think Like Thomas Aquinas. And the reason I liked him is because he was open to all truth, and he got attacked because he liked Aristotle, and he would put forth some Aristotelian and things, and he got attacked because that's not Catholic, that's not Christian. And he said, hey, all truth is God's truth, and some of these things that Aristotle taught were truth. So do you know who Thomas Aquinas' teacher was?
No.
St. Albert the Great. He was before him. Some say he was even greater than Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas, got more publicity, and Albert the Great didn't want to, but he actually taught St. Thomas some memory techniques and things about philosophy, really. And so I love St. Thomas Aquinas. As a matter of fact, I just think he was amazing. And he was, I want to think 12th century or 1300s was what? 12 something. It was 1200, I think. Yeah. And so I think before the what do they call it? The Reformation kind of happened, where they kind of So, man, I love it. We really need to go back. Man, those are the kind of things that we really need to put out there. Well, we're almost out. We're at the hour, my friend. And so, would you come back on the show again? I just want to keep it kind of to an hour, and you've kind of inspired me to, my whole theme is personal growth, motivation, inspiration, but. When I was listening to Megyn Kelly the other day, she was like, the time for sitting this one out is over. I mean, we can't do that anymore. And so, because if you don't, they just keep coming back stronger. But if you take a stand and set a standard, they're going to be really more reluctant to come against us as far as a country and the principles we stand for. And so I'm kind of going in that bend, and you've inspired me by your words. And any last thoughts? And I hope you come on again.
Yeah, in that vein, I just, you have to stand up, and you can catch me as I push back on Twitter at LASD Jordan. I speak on a variety of subjects on Twitter. My new show will begin in December. It'll be the Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and that's Briefing with the Chief. And that will be purely analysts of news and public policy, and get some newsmakers on my show and interview them, just like we're doing here today. And then, of course, you can catch me on my show that's going to be a little more fun. That's Pop Culture Minefield, Morning Coffee with the Chief, where we review movies. But I do relate the movies to what's going on today whenever I get a chance. And I would encourage you, Cliff, to broaden your reach, and do the
I'm
research on the what is actually going on with criminal justice and speak those truths, because the mainstream media won't do that.
I'm inspired to do it, and we all need to do it. And would you do me a favor? Would you send me those links? I'm going to put them in the show notes, everybody. So if you're watching and or listening on YouTube, it'll be in the description. Please, subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple, I'm going to put them in the show notes. I'm going to put all of Pat's, because he's on several different platforms. And so I'll put those in the show notes, Pat, if you'll send those to me on an email or message.
Yeah, I'll send you the ones that are currently going. The ones that aren't yet, I'll send them when I start the shows. All
right. Well, I appreciate that, everything you're doing. And listen, we're all going to stand up one at a time. The power of one is very important. And, unless you have any last words, we're going to end the show. And I want to thank you for coming on. And please come back.
Yeah, I'll come back. And thank you for having me, Cliff. And it's good to see you again.
Yep. Hang out a little bit after the show. We're going to have a little debriefing. Thank you, everybody. This is the Cliff Yates Show, and we'll see you on the next episode.